which was not one place but two, Java Major and Java Minor. Extending thence to the South Pole. This cannot be today's Java. And how Athens had been able to find this place remains a mystery. The inflation of Java, how an island briefly became a continent. Based on a keynote address delivered at GeoCar 2014, Auckland, New Zealand. One measure of the relevance of a discipline is its power to generate public controversy. By this measure, historical cartography is alive and well, and nowhere more than in a debate that has raged on and off for more than 200 years. At issue, do Europeans discover Australasia 80 or so years before the Dutch voyages of the 17th century? If so, who, how and when? It was Alexander Dalrymple, hydrographer to the Royal Navy, who first set this particular hare running. In 1786 he drew attention to what is now called the Dauphin or Harleian world map, since dated approximately to 1547. Which had been lent to him from the collection of Sir Joseph Banks, Fig. 1. Dalrymple implied that James Cook might have borrowed from it, and scholars have advanced many theories to account for its detail and approximately correct placement of Australia. The main obstacle to a definitive explanation has been that there is no known log or chart of a 16th century voyage to account for it. In detail, Fig. 2. It can be seen that the austral landmass is labeled Java Grande, a huge extension southwards of the island of Java. How did this inflation come about? Note the westerly bulge south of Sumatra. The Dauphin map is only the best known of a large corpus collectively referred to as the Dieppe maps, after the French port of origin of most of them, and the non-existent bulge is one of their trademarks. In the absence of a log or chart, and given major errors such as the size of Java, the Dieppe maps can at best be the imperfect record of an otherwise undocumented voyage or voyages. They could also be a complete fabrication. There is, however, an intermediate possibility, namely that they are an attempt to interpret a documented but spurious voyage. In 1988, Helen Wallace, former curator of maps at the British Library, reviewed the Dieppe maps to assess their evidentiary value for pre-Dutch discovery of Australasia. Wallace noted that Admiral James Burney and Matthew Flinders had both been prepared to accept that the north and west coasts of New Holland were Great Java. She remarked on the presence of Portuguese names and Portuguese flags on these French maps and concluded that although the case was non-proven, the balance of evidence is in favor of a Portuguese discovery. Wallace 1988, 35. This paper reviews the evidence and will draw particular attention to two contemporary or near contemporary witnesses. One was himself a mapmaker of the Dieppe school, Guilherme Letestu. The other was a Portuguese cosmographer who some 50 years later was tasked to discover what was described in his instructions as Meridional India, the Indus south of Java. His name was Emmanuel Godinho de Heredia. But first, the cartographic evidence. If, as Wallace considered likely, the discoverer was Portuguese, who could he be? In his 1977 book The Secret Discovery of Australia, Kenneth McIntyre had nominated Cristobal Mendonça, who at Goa in 1520 had been tasked to find Pliny's Isles of Gold, Cres and Argira, reputed to lie beyond Sumatra. His masters hoped that he might there intercept the trespasser Magellan, who was also reported to be looking for them. In fact, Magellan was looking for other isles of gold. King Solomon's mines of Ophir and Tarsus, which he thought would be found in the East China Sea. So here is a Portuguese captain arguably being vaguely pointed in the direction of the west coast of Australia. The difficulty is that every one of the fleeting contemporary references to Mendonca's movements in the Far East tie him firmly to Sumatra and Malacca, giving him little time in between to make the long voyages needed to chart the west and east coasts of Java La Grande. And Mendonca is the only candidate. No other known Portuguese navigator has even been suggested. There is, however, a cartographical hint that Mendonca or his predecessor in those waters, Diogo Pacheco, did find the place they were directed to. Off the south coast of Sumatra there is an island still called Engano, Portuguese for fallacy or mistake. But if Mendonca's is the voyage or voyages so poorly recorded in the Diop maps, it has to be explained how French mapmakers came by the information and why it does not figure in Portuguese maps. Those questions can only be answered with an understanding of the mindset of European explorers in the Age of Discovery. Medieval educated opinion assumed, in the absence of knowledge of the Western Hemisphere, that land would fill the Southern Hemisphere in the same way that Africa, Europe and Asia filled the Northern. Water, on the other hand, had to demonstrate its existence, if only because 2 Esdras, one of the apocryphal biblical texts, said that the earth was 6 parts land and only 1 part water, presumably because God had rested on the 7th day. The most common contemporary interpretation of the Magellan voyage, in spite of the vast distances he had sailed over an empty Pacific, was to assume that south of wherever he had sailed was still land. Robert King has shown that the Diop maps, distinctive though they are, conform in broad outline to mainstream post-Magellanic representations of the yet-to-be-discovered southern continent, and that they show it most nearly approaching the equator in the Australasian quadrant. An early case in point is Franciscus Monarchus. His circa 1526-30 woodcut, Fig. 3, assumes that across the southern hemisphere a circumpolar continent lies somewhere beyond Magellan's horizon, a long way beyond that horizon, below the Tropic of Capricorn. Monarchus does not pretend to know anything about the coast of that continent, he just blocks it in. On the other hand, Monarchus clearly shows Sumatra straddling the equator and southeast of it an island of approximately the right location and orientation for Java. In a presumed to be contemporary oval version of this map, the island is in fact labeled Java. Where then did the Diop school get the notion that the island was part of a southern continent? Helen Wallace believed that all the Java La Grande maps were probably derived from the lost charts of Pierre Crignon and his 1534 manuscript called the Pearl of Cosmography, which is also lost. Crignon was the pilot of a Diop expedition to the east in 1529 which turned back from Sumatra after the death of its leaders, the brothers Parmentier. At Sumatra they had heard of Java, but there is no verified evidence that Crignon or any other French navigator had first-hand knowledge of it. That did not inhibit a naturalized Portuguese sailing in French service, João Afonso, also known Jean de Fontenot, from claiming that he had made a voyage to Java, which was not one place but 2 Java Major and Java Minor. Furthermore, he said, Java Major is mainland. This notion of 2 Javas, which predates Portuguese arrival in the Indies, had probably originated in confusion about Sumatra, which was sometimes referred to as Taprobana, a name used by Ptolemy, until the mapmakers agreed that Ptolemy had been indicating Sri Lanka. It did not help that the Arabs called Sumatra Jawa. Antonio Pigathetta's account of the Magellan voyage also referred to the 2 Javas, but he had a different pairing. He recorded that the expedition's Moluccan pilot referred to the island of Madura as Java Minor and told them that Java Major was half a league beyond it, which it is. Pigafetta's Java Major can be confidently identified with modern Java because he lists several of its towns and regions, some with names still recognizable today, including Surabaya and Sunda. But how could Pigafetta's information be reconciled with Marco Polo's famous statement that Java was the largest island in the world? The Venetians' general credibility stood high after the Portuguese had verified that it was possible to sail from China to the Middle East, as Polo had claimed. His largest island was probably Sumatra, the Arabs' Java, and Polo's view about the size of Java seemed to have been supported by a subsequent traveler in search of the Spice Islands. Ludovico di Barthema of Bologna, who had come overland from Europe, reported that while sailing south from Borneo in 1502 he had asked the ship's master how he navigated with the pole star no longer visible. The master pointed to the Southern Cross and went on to volunteer that beyond Java there were other races who also navigated thereby, as far as a region where the day lasted no more than 4 hours. This is compatible with Pigafetta's account if Java is Madura and the other races are the Javanese and Sundanese, who speak languages different to Madurese. The compatibility is, however, more apparent than real because Barthema says only that the other races sail to the far south, not that there is land there. Magellan's ship exited the Malay archipelago at Timor, passing south of the real Java. That little island cannot be Polo's Java, so there must be another, bigger one somewhere else. In which direction do Polo and Barthema say Java lies? South. The gores of the Nuremberg globe attributed to Johannes Schoner, Fig. 4. Show a southern landmass, labeled Java, separated from what would have to be either Sumatra or Madura by a channel wide enough to let Magellan's ship Victoria through. Note that, as with Monarchus, land fills most of the southern hemisphere south of the track. The earliest known diop-style map, Fig. 5. With its trademark westerly bulge south of Sunda Strait, illustrates the rudder of Joao Athens, but it is not his work. It was drawn by Jean Mallard, court poet to the King of France, to illustrate a verse rendition of Athens's manuscript, and dates from 1538/9. Athens's book was a pilot book for the seven seas, and although he claimed to have sailed all the navigations he described, he was prone to exaggeration. It is known that he sailed on voyages to Canada and Guinea, but his account of Canada repeats the errors of previous navigators. His claims about the two Javas are no more reliable. The larger he called Java La Grande, the northern shore of which lay in 15 or 16 degrees south, extending thence to the South Pole. This cannot be today's Java. The north shore of that island, lying in 7 to 8 degrees south, is nearly 1,000 kilometers closer to the equator than Athens's. And how Athens had been able to find this place remains a mystery, given that by then the only recorded French voyage in those waters had been by the Parmeniers, to Sumatra. In interpreting the Athens pilot book, Mallard seems to have concluded that Sumatra must be Little Java and Magellan's ship had sailed between it and Big Java. Mallard limits himself to two labels. Terra Australe is the conventional circumpolar continent necessary to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere, and Catagara is Ptolemy's sea gate to the east, which Magellan's men identified with Timor. After Mallard, Big Java becomes steadily more elaborate on diop maps as the 1540s progress, but still holding to the basic incorrect shape of that first map. Jean Rotz presented an atlas to Henry VIII 2 or 3 years after Mallard's map. Rots rejected Mallard's interpretation of Sunda Strait as the Magellan expedition's way out. He lifted the north shore of Java to its correct position and provided Bartholomeo's Channel through it for Magellan's ship. He was unconvinced that Big Java extended to the South Pole or was part of a circumpolar continent, but left the question open. He is, however, far more precise than Mallard about its outline. Pierre Desailliers, who had succeeded Crignon as Diop's senior cosmographer, modified Rod's Big 5. Although he kept Big Java where Aphant says it started 15 or 16 degrees south and retained Rots's channel, he registered a reservation. Between the two Javas there are men wielding picks. Are they digging the channel, keeping it open, or filling it in? Desailliers was able to delineate the north coasts of the Sunda Islands relatively accurately thanks to the Portuguese because it was their route to the Moluccas. They had reached Timor as early as 1515. The south coasts of the Sundas, however, remained a mystery to them. Even the early Dutch maps of the Indies, made nearly a century later, showed the south coast of Java as unknown. Another question therefore arises, if, as has been alleged, records of Portuguese voyages to Java La Grande cannot be found because these were state secrets, how is it that Diop's French mapmakers had been able to get such good information about the island route to Portugal's most valuable possession, the Spice Islands? Although Mallard's 1538/9 map had followed Aphant's text, the mariner's own map, not drawn until 1544-45, made a more modest claim, Big 7. It only nudged south of Java Head, but south it definitely was, and in the accompanying text Aphant said that Java La Grande was mainland, holding west to Magellan Strait and east to Terra Australe, that is, as drawn by Mallard. Aphant's map places his Java Minor, labeled as such, to the east of Big Java. Some scholars have identified it with Sumbawa or one of the other lesser Sunda Islands, but it is more likely to be Madura. Note Aphant's orientation of the Madura Channel, in W2SE, which is correct. In other words, what to Rots and Desailliers is Big Java is Little Java to Aphant. The Dauphin map, Rots and Desailliers all have the channel running Nebraska to SW, which is wrong, but thereby provide Magellan's ship with a way out. Aphant is instead endorsing the Moluccan pilot's information about Madura, leaving only Sunda Strait as a way out for the Magellan expedition. Much hinges on the Sunda Strait region if Diop's Java La Grande is to be attributed to Aphant's spurious voyage rather than Crignon's lost papers or undocumented Portuguese voyages. From Java Head the real coastline runs east, not south as shown in all of the Diop maps. In the western region there is a village called Panambang. If Aphant's restrained view was known to the creator of the Ballard Atlas, which is dated a few years later, it was ignored. The Ballard's Grande Jave, Big 8, was more detailed and labeled than ever before, and Dalrymple, had he known of it, would have felt vindicated in the view that here was the record of a pre-Cook discovery. But the verisimilitude minutely exposes the point of transition from reality to speculation. Java Head is accurately depicted and in the right latitude. The atlas maker has followed Rots in shifting Aphant's continent 9 degrees north to the position of real Java, ignoring Aphant himself and other Diop mapmakers in the process. Panambang is shown, here spelled Palembang. No navigator who knew Java Head could have drawn a coastline south of it, much less stick topographic labels on it. This is a work of imagination, and the same is true of the northern coastline extension that takes in Sumbawa. There is no channel, which is an endorsement of Mallard's interpretation. Magellan's ship must have exited via Sunda Strait. So far as is known, All of the Diop maps are works of art made for display by wealthy individuals rather than for the recording of voyages. One mariner and mapmaker, Guillaume Letestu, William the Stubborn, was conflicted. He was a buccaneer in the fashion of Sir Francis Drake, and indeed lost his life in a joint venture with Drake raiding a Spanish silver convoy in Panama. His was the most beautiful of all Diop maps, Fig. 9. But he knew it was a fantasy and said so. This part, La Grande Jave, of the same land called Terra Australe, unknown to us, is only marked from imagination and uncertain opinion. Letestu 1556/2012. GI. His is probably the most dramatic disclaimer of the Age of Discovery. The uncertain opinions referred to are most likely those of Athens. It was not Letestu's confession, however, but the 1577-80 circumnavigation of Drake, his one-time comrade in arms, which fatally undermined Java La Grande. Unlike the Magellan voyagers, Drake had landed on Java, which he called Java Major. He judged its latitude to a nicety, declaring that the middle thereof stands in 7 degrees and 30 minutes beyond the equator, and sailed thence WSW directly for the Cape of Good Hope without touch of aught but air and water. Drake 1628/1854, 161, until Africa was sighted. Within a few years, even in the absence of further exploration of the region south of the Malay archipelago, the continent of Java La Grande and its distinctive westerly bulge had disappeared from cartographers' maps. Letestu had abandoned continental Java before his death, reverting to a more conventional representation of one of Marco Polo's other hazy southern regions, Lukak, also known as Beach, far to the south of Java. In Letestu's mappement of 1566, Grande Java is our Java, minus a south coast. His Petite Java is an imaginary island east of Lukak and south of the Tropic of Capricorn. As Little Java has now been sent to a corner, it is time to call the other witness, Emmanuel Godinho de Heredia. If there is anyone who can disclose Portuguese knowledge of what lay south of Java, he is the man. From the 1590s onwards, Heredia devoted more than 20 years of his life to an official search for meridional India, the existence of which he never doubted. It would have been hard to find a man better fitted for the job. The son of a Portuguese adventurer and a Macassan princess, he was educated by the Jesuits in Goa, who identified in him a talent for cosmography. He was master of the Western literature on the subject and familiar with the seafaring lore of his mother's people, the Bugis. Furthermore, he had a commission from Philip II, King of Spain and Portugal, to bring this region and its fabled riches within the sphere of the Habsburg Empire. As a royal official, he had access to all relevant documents, including logs and charts, and could require information from any imperial subject. So what did he find? Certainly no record of a Portuguese voyage, but among the native accounts he was particularly impressed with that of Caio Majorel, a petty Javanese ruler who in 1601 had sailed south for 12 days until he reached a land called Luca Antara, rich in spices, sandalwood and gold, where he had been royally entertained. Heredia planned to voyage there himself, but unfortunately the Dutch were becoming dominant in Java and the best he could do was to send a Malay servant. In 1610 the servant returned claiming to have sailed to Luca Antara, which was populated by civilized Javanese people, immensely rich. On the strength of this confirmation, Heredia announced the discovery to the world, equating Luca Antara with Polos Java, Fig. 10. Note moreover that he correctly delineates real Java and leaves Java Minor in the corner where Letestu had put it. None of it of course bears any relation to what is actually found south of Java. But after the Portuguese had been displaced by the Dutch and the discoveries of the latter had started to put Western Australia on the map, the Portuguese court wanted to know if Eendracht's land was Lucca Antara, in which case its presumed riches would by prior right be Portugal's. In his 1630 Atlas João Teixeira concluded that they were different but adjacent. Cortesiro 1960-62. B4PL 467B. Was Lucca Antara entirely a work of imagination? Surprisingly, perhaps not. Several centuries earlier, Javanese navigators had regularly voyaged to and from Madagascar with the monsoon. DNA studies suggest that the population of the island could be descended from SQS 30 Indonesian women who settled there in the 9th century. And it was a region famed for gold, found at Sofala on the other side of the Mozambique Channel. One Portuguese chronicler went so far as to identify Sofala as Ophir, King Solomon's mine. To sum up on behalf of the witnesses, Letestu's first-hand evidence obviates the need for a real Portuguese voyage to account for the dye-up maps. In its place, with a clear line of provenance, we have a spurious Franco-Portuguese voyage, which may account for Portuguese toponyms on French maps. Letestu also justified his own deception. He wrote that he had repeated the Athens fantasy just in case it might happen to be true, to the peril of fellow mariners. Aredia's evidence is more like that of the Hound of the Baskervilles. He did not bark. If he knew of the dye-up maps, and it is hard to believe that he did not, he gave them no credence. If there had been an official Portuguese voyage some 70 years before his time, it was unknown to the authorities who commissioned him, and he found no trace of it in written records or oral tradition in spite of the most diligent enquiries. Unless we assume that the Portuguese authorities kept secrets from this their own servant, there can have been nothing for Aredia to find. All of which is long before the destruction of the royal archives by the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which is sometimes put forward to explain the absence of documentation about speculated early Portuguese voyages. So, what is the verdict on Java La Grande? Is it the product of Portuguese discovery or Gallic imagination? In the absence of any direct evidence other than the maps themselves, historians should own themselves indebted to Letestu for confessing his deceit and exposing the uncritical herd mentality of his dye-up colleagues.